Welcome to a tutorial video on using React. In this video, I'm going to talk about working with modules. In the previous video in this series, when we were working with importing media, we saw that all of our objects, all of which extended React components, were all in one file. And that is, as you're building stuff, a good way to prototype different ideas and put files together. However, as our objects get more complex and they relate to each other in different ways, it becomes more and more recommended to break those objects up into their own files. Or, as JavaScript thinks of them, as their own modules. We can start to break a project up into its parts, work with those parts separately, but know that they interrelate to each other and interact in different ways. We can start to see this with how I've organized this project now. So in the previous example in importing media, all of the objects were in a single index.js file. Now I've separated them out, and this becomes a way to work with different files without needing to touch a single file, change a little bit of code in one place, and know that everything else connects together in different ways. So let's step through this code. We notice, again, coming back to this render function, important every time we think about React is render functions, render functions, render functions. They all render something because we're thinking about a user interface. So down here in what is now line 6, it says React DOM.render, and we're rendering shopping list. Well, in the previous video, shopping list was part of this file, but it's not anymore. What it is doing, however, and as I started to talk about when we're importing media, is we can import other files as well. And that's what I've done. Right here it says import shopping list. This is the name of the object we want to use from and its location relative to this path. So from this local folder, this local directory, shoppinglist.js. So we're looking for the shopping list file, which matches. Notice syntax has helpfully shown that for me right here. So we're saying, okay, I'm importing a shopping list object by that name from shopping list. When it gets ready to render, it will render shopping list and it will call shopping list render function. Let's move over to that file. So this is similar to the last video in that we're still looking at a similar object. However, it gets a little bit different. Now that these are its own file and its own object, we have to think about what dependencies it has and how they relate to each other. The first of which is, if we're going to use anything that has to do with React, for example, React components, we have to import React. So that's the very first line here. We're importing React from React, which is a library within this and a module we have within our packages. The next we're doing is we're importing item from item.js. As I talked about in the previous video, this uses item, and in fact we see this right here on line 8. So we need to make sure it understands item as well. So that's the next thing that's going on. We're importing item so it can use item, but above that we're importing React so we can use React components. And that's what we're doing right here. Class shopping list extends React.component. It is a React component, and it is extending something that it imported right here on line 1. So this code is all very similar, lines 4 through 21, all of which we saw in the previous video. Within its render function, it is returning an unordered list. Within each of those, it is using JSX to call its internal function, create item, passing a single argument each time. Within that, it is calling item and passing in a parameter of number equals and whatever is passed into that function. The new sort of extra thing we need to be aware of is down here in line 23. Similar to us importing, we need to also be aware of how we're exporting different things. This is just a single object in a single file. So export default and then the name helps us to tell JavaScript that that's what we want. We're only exporting one thing, its default is shopping list, and it's a very standard way of writing that. We could actually export multiple things if we wanted to, but we need to be very straightforward. We're going to export a default of shopping list. So in total here, as we're thinking about these modules, we need to import the things we're going to use within the file, then we need to use them in some way, and then finally we need to tell it what we're going to export. So when something else imports this, we know that these match up together. So we're exporting shopping list, we're importing React and item. And in fact, if I jump back for a second for index.js, we see this had a very similar setup. We were importing React, we were importing React DOM, We were also importing index.css, which we're not currently using very much. And then we're importing shopping list. So same layout across all of these files. And we're breaking them all up into different objects that match their own files. Now, thinking through this in relationship to modules within JavaScript. So this file, index.js, is in fact a similar setup to the previous file, shoppinglist.js, we were just looking at. It imports the files and packages we want to use, we use them in some way, and then if another file is going to import this, we would export it. However, because this isn't going to be imported, we don't have to worry about exporting anything right here in this index.js file. But let's step back through here. So, we're in index. Index is using shopping list. We jumped over to shopping list. We saw shopping list is using item. Let's jump over to item. Item looks the same as it did previously, with a couple of extra changes I'm going to talk about here in just a moment. So just like shopping list, it's importing React because we're going to need that for a React component, and down here at the bottom, it's exporting a default item. Now the new changes happen right here on line 7. In the previous video, when we were importing media, we were using a relative path. We were importing that path and saving it as a variable, then using JSX to expand that path when it is compiled. And we remembered, because of Webpack and how React works, we couldn't just use the file itself and the path itself. We had to make sure we saved that and used import to help put it all together for us. So I've changed this a bit more because it's going to help us think through modules even better here. So the new line is on line 2. We're importing CheckMark here. So we're not technically using an image anymore. We're using some emoji, which I'm going to talk about in just a few moments. But we're importing CheckMark, and then down here we're using a value, JSX, to interpolate that. So we're saying whatever CheckMark is, we're getting from CheckMark, go ahead and put it right here. And then we're following the same setup, this.props.number, so the name of the attribute number that is passed as a property to this render function as called by whatever called it, its parent in this case, shopping list. Go ahead and put that number in. And in fact, if we jump over here to the right-hand side and look at this, we can see this already in action. We see checkmark, whatever that is, and we haven't looked at that code yet. And then IAM number 1, IAM number 2, and IAM number 3, all of which is what we expected to see based on the previous video and our previous experience working with this. Let's finally jump over to checkmark to finish this video up. So we see it follows a very similar model to all of the rest of these. It imports React because we will just be using React throughout this. And down here it exports checkmark because it's a checkmark file and that's what it's exporting as a default. Now we're moving away right here. Instead of using an object, I'm using a constant and defining basically a variable that will not change and then exporting it out as if it was any other object, and then we're using that value through JSX within item to show whatever checkmark is. What checkmark is right here. It is a span with its role acting as an image and a label of checkmark so that any screen readers will know this is a checkmark. And then we're using emoji right here to show the checkmark symbol we want represented as a character instead of as an image. Now the reason I'm doing that is because it will help with scaling and screen reading and other purposes. While we could easily include an image, and in fact in the previous video we did, if we care about how things are scrolled, how things are seen, using symbols and other characters that will scroll with font sizes and font changes and screen sizes and resolution changes are a far better approach. We need to sort of keep in mind our audience. Images are very useful, but unless we wanted a bunch of different images for a bunch of different screen sizes and how they relate to each other, we can just use symbols and rely on the browser to interpret the font sizes and font changes correctly, knowing that all of the characters will be consistent within those font choices. So that's a good reason to think about using emoji for this very specific purpose. Emoji is not always the best, but in this very specific way, using a checkmark emoji for the use of a checkmark is a perfectly fine and surprisingly efficient way to solve this problem. But let's rewind and review everything I've talked about in this video. So Let's start with CheckMark, and I'll work my way backwards. So I said CheckMark is in fact a const, and we're exporting it back out, which means we can use it in another file. Moving from CheckMark, we saw CheckMark was in fact used in item. So item had to import CheckMark. Then we saw down here in line 7, we were using JSX and interpolating that value. So for whatever it is, give us that value, and its value is a span that's an image, or acting in the role of an image, with a screen reader label of CheckMark and using the CheckMark emoji, which we saw over here on the right hand side when it was finally rendered for us and shown when it was compiled. So item, as we know, is actually used within shopping list. So moving back over to here, we saw we need to import React, we need to import item because shopping list uses item, and it exported out shopping list because that is the object, the single object that's within this file. Finally, coming all the way back, we saw in the index.js file that React DOM.render was using shopping list. And to make sure we use it, we imported shopping list from that file. So, when we're using modules in JavaScript, this allows us to break up complex projects into smaller pieces we can work with individually. Instead of needing to change a single file and a bunch of different code, we can make one change, for example, in checkmark.js and not have to worry about the code in item or shopping list or even index.js because each of the files are encapsulated as different modules. The code is separated, but we know they react with each other, pun there, and interact with each other in different ways. So working with modules is a very smart and efficient way to break up our objects into their own files, knowing they all relate to each other, and then we just need to remember how we're importing things, if those files are going to be used within whatever we're working on, and exporting it back out if another file is going to import the file we're working on. Thanks for watching.